This is the BBC Third Programme. Portrait of Schoenberg. Tonight we're repeating a radio study of his personality compiled by Hans Keller. It consists of the recorded recollections of Schoenberg's friends, colleagues, and his widow. It's illustrated with gramophone records, and Mr. Keller introduces it.
Here's Mrs. Gertrud Schoenberg, the widow of the composer.
Firstly, I would say that the most remarkable thing is that even he had no support at all from his family. He got to be a musician. But those little books which come out recently, they always claim that Schoenberg had a mother who was a piano teacher. Now this I know wasn't true at all. Yeah. And the cool thing is that everything which is wrong is right away believed and gets in all the biographies, and I just want to try to at least have those things right which are important. And this, I think, is very important, that Schoenberg was one of those who really was an autodidact and who really had to be a musician.
What indeed was his family background? Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno, a composing pupil of Alban Berg's and one of the leading philosophical minds of our time.
I had the impression of a man who is without a family, without anything that he carries behind him, somehow as though he were fallen from heaven. And this was later corroborated by Berg, who once told me that he very rarely, if at all, spoke about his parents. You had the feeling of an absolute individual, not linked at all with any family background or national background. This feeling of the absoluteness of the individuality impressed itself very strongly upon myself.
Hans Nachot, Schoenberg's cousin, a noted tenor at the Vienna Opera, who sang in the first performance of the Gurre-Lieder, came to the studio a few days before his death last July. He died at the age of 83.
Arnold was the eldest child. He was a wild and energetic boy, known already in his early days by his witty and cheeky repartee. He had one exact and clear working brain, which made him already famous during his school days. He could not play any instrument really well, although he played them all. One can imagine what a shock it was for the family when Arnold one day came home declaring, "I'm fed up, I'm not going back to the office, I shall become a musician." There was an uproar in the family about this odd boy, and I remember a council of the family was called to consider what to do to prevent Arnold becoming a bohemian instead of a useful citizen. Zemlinsky was Arnold's first and only teacher, from whom he learned the rules of counterpoint. Zemlinsky, under whom I sang for about 12 years, told me often that Schoenberg understood and learned everything in no time and without apparent effort. It happened one day I was a student of the Academy of Music then, that Arnold gave me a manuscript of a song, asking me to sing it. It was the beautiful tenor song from the Gurre-Lieder, "So tanzen die Engel." I sang it, and he was satisfied with my singing, and in his later days he told me that he had my voice in mind when he composed the tenor part of the Gurre-Lieder.
O tanten die Engel vor
I cannot forget his sparkling eyes when he was young. I never saw eyes like his again. He had the look of a magician or a hypnotist.
Ernst Krenek, the composer.
Very characteristic, these piercing eyes, which at the same time are very fast moving, which in a sense was perhaps a contradiction. His self-assertion was certainly something magnificent.
Felix Greisler, a pupil of Schoenberg's who became his son-in-law.
It was a great surprise to me. I had seen pictures of Schoenberg, photographs in the windows of music stores in Vienna, and also the famous Schiele drawing, which everybody knows. And I had pictured from that, my impression was that he was a tall man, and there enters a man well below middle size. But of course, everything was overpowered by the strong face and the unbelievable eyes, which were the most wonderful feature of him.
Roberto Gerard, who of course was a Schoenberg pupil.
To me, Schoenberg was quite an ordeal, you know. He was rather terrifying, I can tell you. I remember the face, and that ascetic face, those burning eyes, serious, tense, unsmiling, a man with a sense of mission. It was tremendous. What was so terrifying about him had less to do with his personality than with circumstances which had forced him to adopt an attitude which then became a kind of second nature with him. And what forced him to adopt his attitude, I can't help thinking, must have been, in the first place, the crowd of worshipping disciples. In the second place, the crowd of fanatic admirers. And in the third place, an equally fanatic crowd of detractors. So the man was forced into a kind of splendid isolation. He had to adopt a defensive attitude. When I say defensive, I mean, of course, aggressive. He knew very well that the only way of defending oneself is to attack. And you had to be very careful, because he was constantly on the watch out for something which he might have felt he could not let pass. And you were always in the danger of having your head bitten off, or in anger he could be of a devastating, sarcastic expression.
Oskar Kokoschka.
When I met Schoenberg, it must be ages now. Really, I can't tell you dates. Probably 1907 or 8. It was nearly 100 years. No, I can't reckon. Yeah. Music was his life. And that I understood, because painting was my life. I couldn't talk. He couldn't talk about other things. He only talked about these essential things which concerned him. Yeah? So I said, I paint him. And then he took to painting as well. He did marvelous paintings.
What do you think of his paintings?
Oh, very good. That was life. He gave life, expression. I would call him, I don't like this word, it's too much, it's misused, expressionist. Now it's leveled as a movement. It wasn't a movement.
There are so many people who say that his paintings were very amateurish, which possibly they were.
What is amateur painting today? They have no judgment today, no? These people, no. But Schoenberg could express himself in the way of a painter just as it was needed. If you can read a painting, a visual record, then it's enough. What else? He was not experimentalist, but he was a man, realist. He wanted not more than exactly his vision, how it ought to be done. He wasn't a revolutionary. This new tonality, no, that's just a new way of... what else did late Beethoven?
Kokoschka then talked about Schoenberg's first wife.
I loved her very much. She was always there. No? She was the sister of the great conductor and composer Zemlinsky, whom I also loved. I did also drawings of him. I forgot that. It's too long ago. No? But I loved her because she gave Schoenberg real atmosphere. It was like, I always said, like a Russian oven. Huh? He loved warmth, you see, and she gave it to him. She was a stout lady and maybe simple-minded, I don't know. But what he needed was warmth and quiet atmosphere.
Felix Greisler, that's the son-in-law you'll remember.
After his first wife died, and when he felt very lonely, my wife and I offered him to live with him, which we did for a couple of months, you see, and it was very, very difficult. We used to have fights almost every day about really minor matters, you see. So that one day it was impossible to live further with him. We packed and moved out into our apartment, which we still had, you see, with the child, which was about a year and a half old, whom Schoenberg loved very much, by the way, a boy. And we moved out, and it was fierce. We didn't talk to him, nothing. We left, we said goodbye, and he nodded, fury in his eyes. And there was sometime on a mild spring day, the same day at night, at 9 o'clock, I lived on the second floor, close to the street. Somebody threw pebbles on my window. I opened the window, and down there was Schoenberg. He said, very meekly, may I come up? So I said, oh, please do come up, by all means. And he came up, he apologized, and he said, I'm sorry, you're of course absolutely right. You cannot live with me, that's impossible. I am impossible, and the whole situation is impossible. But of course we can come to each other, you see. And I am over the worst after his wife died. And very nice and a wonderful man.
His warmth and his aggression seem to have been flames from the same emotional fire. Mrs. Schoenberg.
Stokowski was a great friend of Schoenberg. He liked Schoenberg, and Schoenberg liked, of course, to be liked, which is understandable after so much enemy he encountered. And also Mitropoulos. But nevertheless, if somebody, even Mitropoulos, who played his things, when he did something he didn't like, he attacked him terribly. So he never thought about being nice to somebody who did anything with musical taste against his perception of... and this is why people say he was disagreeable, and he couldn't stand any difference when he did a work, and he showed how he wanted to have it, and he wanted it exactly like he was doing it.
And here's Krennic again.
Heated discussions or controversial arguments had frequently nothing to do with music at all. It was about other things, about political matters or social affairs or personal things. It was not so much the music or the values which he saw incorporated in his works. It was all sorts of matters in which he seemed to entertain very definite, strong opinions. And actually a man of the width of his interests had just opinions on a great many things. But he certainly wanted always to be right. There is a well-known thing that he seemed to know everything. When he started taking lessons in tennis, he would, after the first lesson, he would start instructing the instructor.
Tennis, Mrs. Schoenberg.
He loved to play tennis very much, and it was very good for his asthma, because when he went to the tennis court, he still fought for air. And the moment he was on the tennis court, he forgot, and he breathed very deeply and could run, and it was really a health treatment too. He played a lot, and I fostered that very much. I told him that he was very good, and we played tournaments together, which was really very funny, because he looked like a big athlete. He looked like they always first, when we came on the court, were very afraid of him as tennis player. In France, they always said in Monte Carlo, they said, le professeur, And he was very proud because the professor was not a professor, but that was the coach, the tennis coach. He was very dark, skinned, and so they always said he was a tennis coach. You couldn't make him happier than telling him that he looked like a tennis coach.
Roberto Gerard on Schoenberg in Spain. That was in the early 30s.
His favorite relaxation was going to town, going shopping, or sitting in cafe terraces. Football, he liked football very much, and of course his passion was tennis. He played very badly. But I remember once I could bring him together with an ex-Spanish international, Sindreu, and asked him to have a few matches with him. And Sindreu played and displayed all his marvelous ability. And Schoenberg was, of course, duly impressed. But towards the end, he was very clever in managing to let him win one game. You should have seen the transformation of Schoenberg's face. He really executed a kind of victory dance after that match. And I have still somewhere a snapshot where I got him on a very high jump, at least a couple of feet off the ground, beaming all over.
Sir Arthur Bliss.
In 1940, I was at the University of Berkeley in North California, and Schoenberg was living near Los Angeles in the south. I wrote to ask whether I could come and see him before I returned to England, and Mrs. Schoenberg kindly invited me to lunch. I was a little nervous about meeting so formidable a musician, but nothing could have been easier or more charming. Kolisch, the brother of Mrs. Schoenberg and the leader of the Kolisch quartet, was also there, and before I knew it, I was drawn into making a fourth in a game of table tennis. Never in my wildest dreams did I imagine myself playing ping-pong with Schoenberg as a partner. I remember he had a theory about angles on the table, but apart from that, my memory calls up nothing but his almost youthful amusement.
Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno reflects and sums up.
I think that he, being under a terrific mental pressure all the time, that he needed a very strong counterbalance, and that all these things played a very large role in his life, and that the amount of time he spent in tennis playing and ping-pong playing would seem to a kind of abstract calculation of one's forces inadequate. But on the other hand, one cannot calculate the powers of a genius, and he obviously needed it in order to reproduce his own working capacity. But he was passionately interested in anything that had to do with tennis and with ping-pong, and also, I think, for some time with chess. He invented a three-dimensional chess play. He was extremely far away from the picture of the intellectual. He was an absolutely naive sort of artist, and his theories had very often the character of auxiliary hypotheses, which he invented in order to justify what he made, but were as rationalizations themselves of rather a naive nature.
So when you said that he tended to stick to his words, one should perhaps remind people that he only stuck to his words, but not in his music.
Certainly not in his music. His music was always and ever incomparably more than anything he intellectualized or he theorized about it. He was one of the great composers, and the viewpoint from which everything he did should be considered is that of a great composer.
Leonard Stein, the pianist and Schoenberg pupil.
Nobody knows the amount of sweat and energy goes into work. That's everybody's problem. However, I would say that he enjoyed work. He enjoyed being active. That if he were not composing, then he would be in his other adjoining room, binding books, making inventions. Sometimes, as I mentioned to the young students, even with his 12-tone tables, sometimes they would come out in the form of a prayer wheel. All kinds of ideas. He made many interesting inventions about traffic systems, about the way, our freeways in America now, designs for various kinds of rulers for musical notation, 5-line staves and things of that sort. So that I would say that work as such he loved very much.
Roberto Gerard and Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno, who don't know each other, proffer strikingly parallel impressions of Schoenberg's face and his physical appearance.
He looked more like a gypsy than the traditional, or what we imagine to be the traditional Jewish facial features.
The impression I had first was that of a man who seemed of a very cultured elegance, very well dressed, extremely well dressed, I should say, and with some features, in his external appearance, of a gypsy. I knew at that time a gypsy violinist at a Viennese bar, at the Renaissance bar, who physiognomically reminded me very strongly of Schoenberg. Frankly, if I hadn't known that he was Jewish, it probably wouldn't have occurred to me. He looked to me much more Hungarian or Southeast European than Jewish.
Schoenberg the teacher, Clara Steuermann, the widow of the pianist and Schoenberg exponent, who became herself Schoenberg's assistant.
I still remember the first day that I came to my first class. It was to be a class in the structural functions of harmony, and there were a group of us there who were terribly interested and terribly excited, and so we were really waiting with great expectancy what would happen when the great man would appear. And then there did hurry into the room a rather short man with very, very gleaming bright eyes, and he came up to the front of the room and he stood there for a moment looking at all of us, and then he plunged in immediately with the question, what is a cadence? And we all tried, of course, to satisfy him, and we said one thing and another, but he wasn't satisfied with anything, and then finally, when we had all just about given up, so he said simply, it just marks an ending of one part, and after which something else can begin again. And so that's how we started our work with him. And he had incredible intensity, incredible enthusiasm for music. And for those of us who came to him for the first time, I think it was really like opening a completely new door into a completely new world. I had been living with music from the time I was a very small girl, and I had already had studies in various aspects of music theory. But here, for the first time, I felt this absolutely impelling quality about a musician and a personality, and I would have believed whatever he told me. Fortunately, what he said was so beautifully logical and so wonderfully clear and made such absolute sense that it was like bringing the order of heaven down to the world of music.
Egon Welles, who of course was one of Schoenberg's earliest pupils.
I think that one can't understand Schoenberg without taking into account that he was primarily, to the last moment of his life, a teacher. And that nobody I know took so much pain to teach his pupils in the right way. That is, he began with Bach, because the music from Bach onwards is in our blood. And he took the greatest care to teach, first of all, the right kind of harmonic progressions, so that one knew exactly when a climax was reached and when it came down. This is something which I find that so few people on the continent realized, and it may explain the discrepancy between their composition and their orchestration.
which not always coincides, whereas with Schoenberg it always coincides.
Rudolf Kolisch, whom Bliss has already mentioned. He's Schoenberg's brother-in-law, that's to say Mrs. Schoenberg's brother. He was leader of the Kolisch Quartet and is perhaps the leading Schoenberg exponent.
My first impression of him was that of an awe-inspiring person. Of course, such an impression is, as you well know, very complex. It's hard to describe it. It is not easy to remain cool and reasoning in the face of this phenomenon. I would say that the main characteristic of his teaching was the ethical side. It was, of course, a very different kind of teaching. His standards were absolute. And in my case, that meant that I stopped composing, as in the case of many other pupils.
Did he tell you to stop?
Not at all. He only made me feel that I was not a composer who would be relevant, and I just gave it up.
Leonard Stein again.
What did he teach? Not 12-tone composition, not atonality. His teaching was always based upon classical procedure, how to construct a theme, the models that were used, first Beethoven, then the whole Viennese school, Haydn, Mozart, Schubert, Brahms particularly. And I'm sure that if there's to be found any prototype for Schoenberg's own thematic writing, it really lies in the constructions of Brahms. We had quite a few conversations on 12-tone composition. As a teacher, when anybody brought him music of this sort, he would say, now I have no objective standard for this. I can only tell you what I think. Whereas in all other composition, there would be a very definite procedure and actually very few remarks from him about how to write 12-tone music.
Dika Newlin, who became Schoenberg's pupil at the age of 14. She's a pianist, composer, musicologist, whose standard work on Bruckner, Mahler, Schoenberg himself didn't altogether approve of.
Schoenberg insisted on a very strict background for the student. In other words, he did not believe that you can start right in and teach beginners the 12-tone method. He insisted that one have a good foundation in 18th century counterpoint, also in the use of various 18th century forms, not only in studying and analyzing the works, but also in essaying to compose in these forms themselves. Even those students in the university who were not going to be composers primarily, of whom there were quite a few, were made to go through this very strict training. From there, the student could develop as he was able to develop. Schoenberg never in any way imposed the 12-tone method on students. In fact, he said the method is so personal that it would be very difficult for me to correct somebody else's piece written in this way. I would end up by recomposing it myself.
Back to Clara Steuermann.
The question periods were usually rather embarrassing because he always had the answer in his mind quite exactly, and I guess he always expected that someone would tell him exactly what he had in mind, and this, of course, no one could do. And so it would always turn out that we would give this and this and that, no, and then he would come with something very simple. He wanted very much that music should be discussed in simple language. In his relation to his students, he was always terribly correct, but it was, I would say, very European as compared with American university professors who establish very if a kind of more intimate relation with the students, and any student could make an appointment with Schoenberg if they had difficulties and so, and come to him and talk with him. But he didn't stand around after class chatting with the students, and he didn't come in early and speak with the students. The bell rang and everybody was there, and Schoenberg came in with the assistant who was taking the class, and after the class he would go out. So there was a little bit of formality, but he was very human in his teaching. He had a very nice sense of humor. He liked very much to make jokes. We very often laughed a great deal. I must say they were never jokes at the expense of anyone else. He never made jokes about other composers, for instance, or colleagues or anything of that sort. His jokes were always nice intellectual exercises in humor.
Karl Rankel, formerly musical director of Covent Garden, was a Schoenberg pupil as a composer.
At the teaching hours, he was really the most interested man himself in everything you produced or you said or you did. Apart from that, when the clock struck and it was finished, he didn't speak a word. That was quite a different world.
So he was, in fact, much closer to one when he taught in teaching hours than outside.
Yes, surely, yes.
Well, was that not painful?
I don't think so, because his strangeness, when he had finished, was something very, very beautiful.
Clara Steuermann.
As an employer, as my professor at UCLA, for whom I worked as an assistant, he was always a very perfect gentleman. He was very kind and gracious. We worked very well together. However, he had a certain reserve, which had to do with the fact, I think, that he did not easily become open in conversation and so on with ladies. From my own experience, I never had difficulties with him, but then I must be fair also and say that I was not in such a close relation to him as other people were. And naturally, for me, I must also say that I really worshipped him, and I would have never in the world, been that aggressive or I don't know what to rouse his anger or something of that sort. The only time that I had a bit of difficulty, I recall, was when I wrote my master's thesis and submitted it to him, and apparently he didn't like it. And he had called me to his home to explain this to me. And he was terribly gentle, but yet he had to make me understand that he wanted pretty much everything done differently, and it meant an enormous amount of work to redo it. But there again, I suppose that in a similar circumstance with someone that he had known longer, or even if it had been a man, perhaps he wouldn't have been so careful. But with me, he was.
I asked Rudolf Kolisch what, in one word, he gained most from Schoenberg's teaching.
Mainly the respect for great music, traditional music, because that was, as you know, characteristic for him.
Leonard Stein.
He showed his consideration as a teacher by teaching much more than he was required to, and spent much time making examples for students in all subjects, which later have appeared in books that I've been very fortunate to be associated with. He was a thoroughly dedicated teacher and tried to simplify his material so that any student could understand it. As a matter of fact, he said, after he wrote a book called Models for Beginners in Composition, that he could even teach this subject to tables and chairs. The one thing that sticks with me is his ability to improvise, always examples on the spot. I know it was a great disappointment to Schoenberg when he had to retire at the age of 70, not only because the university paid him so little in the way of a pension, I think something like $29 a month, and this is when he had still a family of 3 young children, but also because it pushed him aside as a teacher. And I believe this was actually a contributory cause of his failing health in later years. He loved the contact with the students, and he always rose to the challenge of teaching them.
Felix Kreisler.
He started teaching us there. I remember that it was the 32 variations of Beethoven for piano, which he analyzed. And he used to analyze by asking us quite a lot of things. You see, to study with him was for 2-3 lessons a quite ordinary experience. It was just like any other lesson. But in the 4th or 5th lesson, all of a sudden he would jump up and intuitively start talking, and he would tell us things about music we never heard before and never again. You see, things I think no other teacher was able to convey. So I went to this course for a number of weeks, and one day, after I had given an answer which apparently pleased Schoenberg, he invited me to come to his home on a certain day, which I did. I didn't know what was the matter, you see. He asked me to sit down, and he started to cross-examine me, truly cross-examine me about music, about my occupations. He looked at the works I had composed. He asked me innumerable questions. He tested my ear in a very difficult manner. And this interview went on for a long time, 3-4 hours. Finally, at the end of that, when I was really exhausted, he said to me, "Your next lesson starts Thursday at 5 o'clock. You will be here." So I said to him, "I'm sorry, I cannot ask you to teach me because I don't have the money." So he barked at me, "Who asked you for money? You just come."
Egon Welles.
I would say, I don't know anybody who was such a great teacher, because he sacrificed himself completely. The only way of approach to the work of a pupil is to identify oneself with the work of the pupil. And he really did it to the utmost. First to understand what this man wanted to do. And then came the great thing. When he found a weak spot or something wrong, he said, "You see, one could do the following," and he wrote it down. Or you could do that. Or you could do that. So that the pupil instantly saw that the way of invention was not mechanized, but that there was an enormous variety, and that the real composer could always choose which was the best way.
Is it just wrong to say that he was in any way a dictator when he
I
taught?
think it is wrong. It is, but on the other hand, he had such an enormous personality that Berg and Webern, in a quite unusual way, were submissive to him. I think in England it would be quite impossible to act like these grown-up people did, rather a little ridiculous. When he saw works of Berg and Webern, he tried to correct passages which he didn't find very well, and made suggestions. But he would never have said, "This must be."
Felix Kreisler again.
I remember in about 1925, he all of a sudden called all his students and friends together. You see, he had a meeting at which they were present. Alban Berg, Anton Webern, Egon Welles, Steuermann, Erwin Stein, and many others. And there he began to develop the 12-tone theory. In other words, he explained to us the row and the 4 forms of the row, and he also showed us certain fragments he had composed this way, a piano piece, I remember, and some other music I don't quite remember whether he ever used it later or not. And we all tried to understand, and I think we came pretty close to what he meant, except there was one person who resisted more by being silent and not saying anything, you see. And that was Anton Webern. He was the one who resisted most. At one point, when Schoenberg said, there I used the Rhode transposition, and I transposed it to the tritonus. So Weber said, why? Schoenberg looked at him and said, I don't know. And then Weber burst out, So because Weber was waiting for some intuitive sign, you see, in the whole matter, and this was it, you see. The fact is that Weber, for about 3 years after that, did not write anything. Because somehow he had to come around to this, you see. I think this very fine character who does it, and does not sit down and write. It took him a long time. So he finally then wrote during this time. I think he revised the former piece, orchestra piece, something like that. But he did not write music.
Perhaps one ought to briefly explain Kreisler's point here. Webern suspected Schoenberg's new theory so long as Schoenberg could give reasons for it. He began to trust it when Schoenberg couldn't, because Webern believed in intuition. Now to René Leibowitz, a Schoenberg pupil from whose performance of the Gurre-Lieder we have heard an excerpt. I talked to him about Schoenberg's relation to Berg and Webern. Do you think that he felt closer to one than the other?
If anything, I would say to Webern. In the first place, he dedicated the work to Webern, and he never dedicated one to Berg. Perhaps yes. Because...
that could be the other way around, if I may be complicated.
Absolutely. Right? You're quite right. But I also have a feeling that somehow there may have been a little more respect for Webern than for Berg. I don't quite know why I'm saying this. I may be wrong, but it's sort of an impression I have.
Do you think it might be because of the great adventurousness of...
Could very well be.
Webern's creative character?
Could be.
Oskar Kokoschka.
Webern was a saint. He was the dearest to his heart, Webern. And for me too. Webern was a pure musician, a pure artist. In a way, I would say an artist without any reality around him.
Karl Ranko.
Berg, I think, was nearer him than Webern. There's a composer and there's a person. Webern, I thought, was always a little stranger. Perhaps because of his environment. His family was a very strange party.
Gertrud Schoenberg on Schoenberg's relation with Webern and Berg.
It was a friend relation. It was not only a musical relation. And also, I must say that friends always also very often fight against each other and then they get friends again. So this was a real relation.
Webern and Berg were very different personalities.
Absolutely. So I must say opposite poles. And the letters, I have still proves this kind of thing. And Webern was very jealous about the friendship Schoenberg had for Berg too, and in the first stage of their lives,
Probably Webern was more jealous than Berg.
Yeah, no, Berg was
not jealous.
There was a very kind and good character, always.
Die Canulin.
Well, in the case of Berg, and also, I think, in the case of Webern, a certain jealousy entered in, since Berg, after all, had such a big stage success in Wozzeck, something which Schoenberg never quite had with any of his stage works. I feel that he resented this a little bit. Also, he very definitely did resent, and I can only concur with him in this, the attitude, this was already beginning in the later years of Schoenberg's life, that after all, Schoenberg is more or less old-fashioned, an old fuddy-duddy, obsolete. Music begins with Webern. And, of course, Schoenberg couldn't take this. Certain people had taken some of his principles too literally and applied them in a way which was more academic and more sterile than the strictest old counterpoint. We all know cases in which this is true, and he was very distressed by this development. It was interesting, incidentally, in the same connection, his attitude, especially towards Webern. He used to get quite impatient and say, Webern, you went too far. You went too far.
Felix Kreisler.
I remember that Darius Mio told me a story that after the war, Mio went to, or long after the war, As a matter of fact, a short time before Schoenberg died, Mio went to Paris, and then he came back, he visited Schoenberg, and who was already rather weak. And he said to him, you know, everybody is composing 12-tone in France. And in Europe, all over, everybody, you see. You have conquered the world. Complete silence. And after 5 minutes, Schoenberg turns to Mio and says, I just hope they make music with it. Which I think, you see, it shows the man, it shows that all this, you see, that for instance, his famous and often maligned 12-tone theory, that all was done only in order to have logic in the music. When he wrote this violin concerto, which he wrote already in America, he sent me the score in installments, asking me to make a violin piano version, which I really did, and I found, of course, mistakes he had made in the manuscript. I asked him the questions. I sent the first movement finished back with a set of questions. And he would come back with corrections or saying, no, I wanted it this way. After about on the third or fourth page in the score, I found a mistake in the 12th-tone row. So I asked him that, and he answered all questions but this one. In the second movement, I repeated this question. Again, he answered all other questions but the one about the 12th-tone row. You see, there was a mistake, which he carried on then through the whole piece. And then came the third movement. Again, the same thing happened, so I got very desperate. I sent him a special delivery letter, you see, a return receipt, and God knows what, and I asked him questions, you must answer it, because this will go to print now. And so back came, as an answer, only a postcard. And the postcard had one sentence which, translated into English, sounds best, so what? German, now und wenn schon. See, meaning, after all, that he made music, and the 12th-tone was a vehicle, but not more than that. That music was much more important. And that was his attitude throughout his whole life. And that is the great misunderstanding of many people, that Schoenberg was so a brain composer.
Roger Sessions, the American composer.
One evening I said, you know, I feel that the 12-tone system has been so much emphasized in the press, so much publicized, that it has very often come between listeners and your music. And Schoenberg nodded and he said, yes, of course you're right. He said, I have to confess that it's partly my fault. And then he got quite animated and he said, but it's much more the fault of some of my disciples. And Schoenberg was Well, very, very eminently not a pedant in any sense of the word. He was an artist.
Humphrey Searle, who wasn't a Schoenberg pupil, he studied with Weber.
In the hour of Schoenberg's 75th birthday, a symposium was arranged by the Israeli section of the International Society for Contemporary Music, and I was asked to write a short piece for this. I wrote a little Passacaglia for string quartet, and when it was published shortly afterwards, I sent Schoenberg a copy, and he wrote back a very nice letter about it. But the interesting thing is that the piece was a 12-tone piece, but Schoenberg said of it, "I do not know how far this music is 12-tone or not. I'm a very poor analyst of 12-tone music."
Kokoschka.
Experimenting means a technique. And I'm not interested at all in technique, you see. Schoenberg wasn't interested in technique.
No.
Nothing to do with art. It has nothing to do with a new tonality. It has nothing to do with Schoenberg's music. And it's always misunderstood. What's called a 12 tone. No? What is it? A little different kind of writing. Nothing to do with his music.
Both you and Loos, who weren't musicians, did immediately get Schoenberg's art, whereas musicians who maybe were prejudiced by their own education didn't.
Most of the people are experts. And the expert is always
Yes.
one line, one track line. Eh?
Clara Steuermann.
I think that his strongest drive was that for him, music had to have the same logic and beautiful reason that everything else in the world. And I felt that always very strongly. I don't think he ever doubted that what he believed in regard to the 12-tone composition was in any way faulty. But he did maintain that it was his own private business, and he said that if people want to analyze it, they can, and let them go ahead. But as far as listening to his music is concerned, he felt that it's nobody's business, whether it's 12-tone or 15-tone, if there were that many, and so on.
Rudolf Kolisch on the same problem.
I think that this question, yes, has to be emphasized over and over again. Namely that he was, now I quote him, not a 12-tone composer, but a 12-tone composer. His compositorial considerations were always in the foreground, dominating. And as you will remember, he considered the technique, which he never allowed to be called a system, to be his own private matter, to the extent that he even refused to reveal something about it.
And now René Leibowitz compares Schoenberg's creative attitude with Stravinsky's.
Stravinsky worked in a very craftsman-like fashion, if I may say so. Very lucid, very aware of everything he was doing. Whereas Schoenberg took risks. I always had the feeling that Schoenberg sort of gambled when he composed music. Every time he wrote a new work, especially in the later years where it was really such a colossal effort for him to compose. You know that he had to stay in bed practically for 2 weeks after he had spent 1 week writing. I felt that it was like a gambler who would, play his last stake, his last penny on this particular issue. I preferred Schoenberg's attitude to that of Stravinsky's, which seemed to be very dignified perhaps, but slightly too cautious for my liking.
Stravinsky's caution produced his insistence on single ideas. There's nobody like him who can extend music so fruitfully without contrasts. Schoenberg's personality, both as a creator and indeed as a man, was the opposite. Egon Welles.
He was a man who, just as his music, was working between contrasts. He could be very happy, and suddenly one word would offend him, and he would get moody and disagreeable. And just also the opposite. These were the two sides which came out, and I think also in his music.
I asked Mrs. Schoenberg about what is sometimes described as the unpleasant side of his character.
He was attacked. When he was attacked, of course, he was a very good fighter. And he fought back, but he never attacked first. Never. And he was very easy again to forgive and forget. When we came to America, he was very friendly with all the American composers. And I said, no, Arnold, that's impossible. You really find that they are good composer, when he was asked from the press and so. And then he always told me, there is not so much difference between those and those. And I don't think that they are so bad as people want to say.
Leonard Stein.
I would say that truly he was not that difficult a person. I suppose anybody with really strong opinions, and especially the life that he had led, where he really was a pioneer, and sometimes ferociously attacked. I think we hardly realize that in either America or England. Matter of self-defense, you know. I don't think he gave back any worse in kind than that was delivered to him. But I still saw some of this old fighter instinct in him. But I would say on the whole that this was a man who would listen to people, liked students, and sometimes I would say, thought to myself why he wasted time even on people who hadn't much to offer to him. But if they showed any interest, if they were nice people, let's say, they were polite enough, well-mannered, then, of course, he would give them everything. He was not brusque. He was not cruel to anybody. He would listen to them out and engage in a discussion on anything. He always gave interviews whenever requested, whether on the radio. He made some of his earliest experiences in America was giving broadcasts and speeches for any organization, for any occasion. Music teachers associations, plenty of that sort of thing. For Jewish organizations. Any time somebody requested it. And it wasn't certainly for the money. There was not this mercenary streak about him.
However, he felt alone because he was. Sir Adrian Boult.
When the BBC Orchestra undertook its first European tour and visited Vienna, the variations were put into the program. The chance of giving the first public performance in Vienna of the variations we thought was too good to miss. And in the interval, immediately after the performance of the variations, I was summoned to the president's box, and I'm afraid the president reflected a current opinion in Vienna by asking me some rather naive question, like, who on earth is this Schoenberg? As if he'd never heard of him. I just think he hadn't, because, of course, Vienna was not up at all in its new Vienna School of Music.
Leonard Stein.
I don't recall that Schoenberg ever got a chance to hear in performance, live performance, his violin concerto. He could not have heard the fourth quartet more than once or twice. And I remember some occasions which struck me as being really pathetic. For example, when he wrote his organ variations. Now, this is a work every organist should play. He never heard that played by an organist. And I remember on one occasion he said, when I showed him a piano reduction I had written, he said, would you play that for me? I've never heard this piece.
had not many friends. Also in Vienna, this is also a very funny thing that the people of the mind in Vienna never wanted to see Schoenberg or speak with him. He didn't know all the poets, Schnitzler or Baer, which at this time were, in this cafe house clique, etc. He never met. He was an outcast. They were difficult. They were also much richer than he was, and they were always afraid of the Bohemian who came there.
Rudolf Kolisch. With me he was mostly extremely kind. There was a deep sympathy, but he could also be the other way, and on many occasions was.
Can one define the type of psychological stimulus which would arouse the other attitude in him?
I think one can. It was on the basis of his extreme suspiciousness. He was suspicious almost to a degree of persecution complex. So one could call him paranoid. In fact, it got better towards the later stages of his life. Much better.
There was a better stage much earlier on. Roberto Gerard.
When he laughed, he beamed. He could beam, he could have a beaming face. The face I remember in Spain. He was a different man in Spain. Completely different man. In Central Europe, he lived on a pedestal. And he was surrounded by a kind of no man's land, splendid isolation, and a barbed wire fence in addition, so that he seemed unapproachable. Now, he came to Spain and all that vanished. No more pedestal. He walked on the even ground. He met people on a sort of equal level. And I suspect that the first days in Spain, the first meetings with people in Spain must have been a very novel experience to him. Because suddenly he met people who were not afraid of him. That alone, that made a fantastic change of social climate. And why should they be afraid of him? No one knew who Schoenberg really was. They showed an interest, a very strong, spontaneous, warm interest and respect for the man without knowing who he was. It was just his natural human dignity, which they appreciated. I was amused sometimes thinking that he must feel really like a millionairess who suddenly finds herself courted for her own charms, and not for her money. And I have a clear memory that his face in Spain was the face of a different man. It was the face of a happy human being, He radiated happiness. A few days before he arrived early in October 1931. A few days before he arrived, I met Falla accidentally. And I told him of Schoenberg's impending visit. And he made a great fuss of it. He said, oh, Senor Schoenberg, I do sincerely hope that, your beautiful Mediterranean climate, that sky of yours, it's going to do something to the music you will write here. I suppose you will write some music. When I reported this to Schoenberg, he said, well, yes, maybe all right for Falla, but I can tell you, a back room in a backyard in Berlin is sufficient for me to write good music. Nonetheless, this might make you think that he was quite insensitive to visual impressions. Not true. He loved his window. And the thing to remember is that that is the room where he worked. He had his table right against the window. And he lifted his eyes up from the score, Moses and Aaron, which, as you know, he finished the second act in Barcelona, in that room. It is signed at the end, Barcelona, 10th of March, 1932.
Unvorstellbarer Gott, unaussprechlicher, vieldeutiger Gedanke, lässt du diese Auslegung zu? Darf Aaron, mein Mund, dieses Bild machen? So habe ich mir ein Bild gemacht, falsch, wie ein Bild nur sein kann. So bin ich geschlagen. So war alles Wahnsinn, was ich gedacht habe. Und kann und gar nicht gesagt werden.
When he lifted his eyes from the score, what he saw was that fantastic panorama. It was a smallish room. It had a small upright piano, a table perhaps, a sofa, and a few armchairs, and that was all. And Mrs. Schoenberg and my wife sat at the back of the room, chatting lustily, with quite, without the slightest regard for that man composing there on the window. Because Schoenberg insisted, he wanted them to talk loud. He hated to hear somebody whispering. I'm sure he listened with a kind of, with a quarter over the ear, and when something came up that was gossipy, he joined the ladies. He jumped up and joined the ladies and mixed in the conversation. When he had had enough, he went back to his table, sat down, and was concentrated the next instant. Deeply concentrated, completely oblivious, deaf to the ladies' conversation.
Antal Dorati and Sir Arthur Bliss visited Schoenberg in America. Dorati had known him long before. When you met him in Hollywood, did you notice any character or personality changes?
I think he got more bitter.
Did he complain a lot? And if so, can you remember about what?
It was not exactly a complaint. His voice got much more plaintive altogether, just as a sound. And he had the chip on his shoulder, yes, which of course is not very surprising, because he was really a very much mishandled and misunderstood man. But he had quite a funny way to express this chip on his shoulder. For instance, he told me I should have royalties on all the jazz music. And then I very respectfully ventured to ask him why. And he said, because I give them all their dissonances. Why I visited him was that I was going, and I did invite him, to conduct the Verklärte Nacht, the Transfigured Night, for a ballet performance, which I then currently conducted, which was then very much en vogue. It was given with great success, a great number of times, under the title Pillar of Fire. And this was to be performed in San Francisco, and with the San Francisco Symphony, which was a very nice occasion, and Schoenberg living so nearby, I thought it was a good thing to invite him to conduct the performance, and that's what I did, and he accepted also the invitation. That was the occasion why I saw him.
And he did actually agree to the ballet performance of Verklärte Nacht. He was normally very stern and strict about the mishandling of his music for purposes for which it wasn't written.
Yes, I know that, but this ballet was already done before I ever conducted it. I conducted it as a fact. It has been accepted, it has been performed. But he must have accepted it with misgivings, because when I told him about it, he was very inquisitive and very suspicious. He said, how is this ballet? And I told him it's very good. There's nothing to be ashamed about. It is the scenic unfolding of the poem, which he himself chose as motto for the piece. So it's completely all right, and it was really. And then he was asked how often was it played, and I admitted that it was played about 100 times, which greatly impressed him, because probably at that time his works were very rarely performed still. And then he asked, "Do you think it was on account of the music?"
Now, when he himself came to conduct it, were you there?
I was there, yes. I conducted the rest of the evening.
So you could form a professional impression of his performance as a conductor. I'm asking this because one has so many conflicting views of his competence as a practical musician.
Well, my impression was extremely favorable. I think he did a splendid job, very much matter of fact. He rehearsed very quickly, very efficiently, told the orchestra what he expects them to do, showed it to a good degree, and gave a very functional and very, very good performance.
Did the orchestra respond to him favorably?
Oh yes, they respected him a great deal. It was a great event that Schoenberg came to San Francisco.
Stein confirms this impression.
He was extremely patient as a conductor, and he was a person that really worked hard on scores before he would go in front of the orchestra. But he had essentially a very sound technique as a conductor. He said you always do it with the eyes. On the other hand, I remember my first experience with Schoenberg as conductor was his orchestra arrangement of the Kammer Symphony. And there was a terrible language barrier, and he caught the musicians around Christmas time. But I've never seen a man under duress be so patient. Everything all right, gentlemen? Let's try this again. And infinite pains with doing something which still for these musicians was new music. And they did not respond to it. I think how terrible it was that he should have had to stand this guff from them, but those were the conditions. And finally this concert, which was attended by a handful full of the faithful, he did his string suite for string orchestra, the Kammer Symphony in the orchestra version. And what was the other? Verklärte Nacht, I guess. It would have to be, of course. And, of course, parts dropped out in the middle of the Kammer Symphony, which frankly had to sing himself. I remember the trombone parts he had written. But he was still very patient with the whole thing, and felt that the orchestra had learned something. I remember when I first tried some of his piano pieces myself, he would say first, yes, you did it very well, but, Mr. Stein, and always practical advice about what to do next.
When Bliss visited Schoenberg, Rudolf Kolisch was also there.
Kolisch began to discuss some technical problems of string writing with Schoenberg, and the latter asked to hear a recent recording that the quartet had made of his fourth quartet. I had heard the first performance of this work in Europe. Schoenberg gave me a miniature score and sat back, listening without comment and absolutely still.
The opening of Schoenberg's fourth quartet in the Kolisch performance, which Schoenberg, Bliss and Kolisch heard.
He then asked for the records of his first quartet in D minor.
An excerpt from Schoenberg's first quartet in D minor, again the Kolisch recording.
As he listened to this, I saw Schoenberg was deeply moved. He got up and walked slowly about the room, quite remote. Was he recalling Mödling 35 years before, and his subsequent difficulties and trials and the bitter opposition? I wondered. I left Schoenberg that day feeling I had encountered the most powerful of musical minds.
By way of coda, Hans Swarovski and Theodor Wiesengrund Adorno have tried to outline Schoenberg's character in a few words.
Schoenberg was a very, very, very nice man when he was with men who understood him. He was very helpful to them. You cannot say that this is arrogance when a genius is very reserved against impertinent and stupid. He has the right to ridicule those who put themselves arrogantly in the place of the Creator. Schoenberg was first persecuted for his art. Then he was persecuted for his race. Who would be surprised that he became lightly paranoid?
He had the sense of persecution of someone who actually was persecuted. His mildly psychotic traits were confirmed by reality and therewith became strengthened. And if you are all the time subject to the silliest sort of persecution as he was, it seems to me rather natural that this becomes habitual with you and you react this way even in cases where there doesn't seem to be any direct occasion for it. On the other hand, he certainly shared this quality with quite a few other of the greatest musicians, such as Beethoven or such as Richard Wagner, and there was some natural inclination in this direction in him. Which is the cause and which is the effect is very difficult to find out.
So you would in fact say that it worked out as a vicious circle?
It worked out as a vicious circle, certainly. I should say, and I should like to emphasize this very strongly, that he was basically very good-natured and very generous. I know from Berg and from Webern that at times when they both had great financial difficulties, he helped them in the most generous way. He was extremely generous in every sense, but only as long as it didn't occur to him that he was Arnold Schoenberg. I should say that in all this was an element of naivety. Once in America, he said, really like a bewildered child, I always thought music were an art, but here they really consider it as a kind of industry, as though he had made this discovery for the very first time. One felt the grandeur of him, the truly great man, when one saw him facing a tumultuous and hostile crowd during a performance of one of his works. Then he had such a dignity, such an attitude of standing for what he has done without any air of pretentiousness or of bravado or anything of that sort that one couldn't feel, but being highly impressed by this integrity and this being completely untouched by the ways of the world, so that this integrity and his special kind of naivety were blended very intimately.
Were you present on such occasions when
Yes,
you faced the Hausberg?
yes, several times. I think the songs with orchestra, Opus 22, and the variations for orchestra, if I remember correctly.
That radio study of Schoenberg's personality was compiled and introduced by Hans Keller and produced by Christopher Nupen.